Welcome to The Last White channel. Subscribe now so you don't miss more videos like this one. Somewhere in the archived records of a county hospital that no longer exists, there are intake logs for a ward that was never officially opened. The entries span nearly 14 years, from the winter of 1871 to the early months of 1885, and they list, in careful copperplate handwriting, the names of 43 patients admitted under the care of a single physician. What makes those records disturbing is not the names. It is the column beside them, the one labeled discharge date, which, for 31 of those 43 patients, was left entirely blank. Not marked deceased, not transferred, not escaped, simply blank. For decades, those ledgers sat in the basement of a former county building in upstate New York, unread and uncatalogued, bundled beneath the papers of a man whose medical license had been surrendered quietly, under it without public hearing. In the spring of 1885, his name was Dr. Elias Galt, and if you asked anyone in the village of Harwick Hollow in those years what kind of doctor he was, they would have told you, without hesitation, that he was the finest physician in the county, a man of extraordinary gifts, a man devoted above all else to keeping his patients alive. They were right about that last part. Before we continue with the story of Elias Galt and the ward that time forgot, if this is your first time here, welcome to Liturgy of Fear. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a story like this one. And we'd love to know what state or city are you listening from. Drop it in the comments below. Now let's go back to the winter of 1871, to a valley in upstate New York, where the snow came early and the sick had nowhere else to turn, and the hamlet of Harwick Hollow sat at the bottom of a narrow glacial valley, about 40 miles northeast of Albany, pressed between the Helderberg Escarpment to the west and a dense stand of old-growth hemlock forest to the east. A prosperous place it was not. It had never been prosperous. The farms that climbed the valley's lower slopes produced enough rye and potatoes to keep families fed through the long winters, but not enough surplus to attract the kind of commerce that might have brought a proper town into being. There was a mill, an inn, a general store, a Methodist church of pale clapboard that needed painting, and by 1868, a single-room medical office attached to the rear of the Galt House on Fallow Creek Road. The county seat was in Coxsackie, nearly 2 hours by road when the weather cooperated, which it seldom did between November and April. Before Elias Galt arrived in Harwick Hollow in the autumn of 1866, the nearest physician had been an elderly man named Dr. Prentice Halverson, who traveled a circuit between 4 villages and was known as much for his fondness for bourbon whiskey as for his medical acumen. When Halverson died of a stroke while fording a creek in the spring of 1866, the valley was left with no medical care whatsoever. And the town council, such as it was, being 3 farmers and the mill owner, had quietly begun to despair of attracting anyone qualified to replace him. Elias Galt was 32 years old when he arrived. He came from the city, from Albany, where he had completed his formal training at Albany Medical College, and then spent 2 years working in the wards of Albany City Hospital. His colleagues there would later describe him as methodical, precise, and unusually patient. A man who took careful notes and revised them carefully, who never seemed to tire of a difficult case, when other physicians had hay music, already begun to speak of hopeless situations. He had published a single paper in the American Journal of Medical Sciences in 1864 on the subject of respiratory complications in patients recovering from typhoid fever. The paper was not remarkable. Its tone was what was remarkable, clinical, almost cold, as though the suffering of the patients it described were variables in an arithmetic problem, rather than experiences being endured by living people. Nobody in Harwick Hollow read medical journals. What they saw was a tall, angular man with careful dark eyes and very clean hands. Galt, who arrived on a Tuesday with a leathered trunk full of instruments and reference texts, rented the house on Fallow Crude from the widow Tilda Musgrove, and opened his office within the week. Modest fees he charged. House calls in all weather he made. He did not drink. He attended the Methodist Church on Sundays without apparent devotion, but without apparent reluctance. Polite to everyone and familiar with no one he was. Within a year, he was the most trusted music man in the valley. There was reason for that trust. In his first winter in Harwick Hollow, a diphtheria outbreak moved through the farms along the eastern ridge and killed 6 children before Galt contained it. This he did by isolating the sick, enforcing quarantine with a firmness that irritated several farmers who could not afford to be kept from their livestock. Instead administering treatments, some of them drawn from European literature that had not yet reached standard American practice, that appeared to slow the disease's progression in at least 3 cases where death had seemed inevitable. The children who survived became a kind of testament. Their parents spoke of Galt with a reverence that the Methodist minister found slightly uncomfortable. By the early 1870s, the valley's population had grown modestly, not through prosperity, but through the arrival of 24 German immigrant families who had come to work the limestone quarry that opened on the escarpment in 1869. These families brought with them their own ailments, industrial injuries from the quarry work, the chronic respiratory complaints that came from breathing stone dust, and among the older men, the accumulated damage of decades of hard labor in worse conditions than anything Harwick Hollow offered. They also brought a cultural deference to educated professionals that sat comfortably alongside the valley's existing respect for Galt's abilities. For these quarry workers it was, and for the valley's poorest farming families, that Galt proposed the ward. He came to the town council in the winter of 1870 with a proposal written in the same precise hand that filled his patient ledgers. The valley, he argued, needed a facility for the care of patients whose conditions required sustained attention. Not the kind of sustained attention that could be provided by a family with a farm to run and other children to feed, but the continuous, professional attention that only a dedicated medical environment could offer. A building for the purpose he had identified, the old Renner farmhouse at the end of the hollow, which had stood empty since the Renner family departed for Ohio in 1868, and whose owner, a man in Albany who had inherited it without interest, was willing to lease it for a modest annual sum. The council approved the proposal with some hesitation. One member, a farmer named Cornelius Vander, raised the question of oversight. Who would inspect the facility? Who would ensure that its operations met the standards of the county medical board? Patiently, Galt answered that he would maintain full records and submit them to the county medical officer annually, as required by law. The facility would not be a formal hospital, he explained, but a private care home operating under his license, which relieved it of certain regulatory burdens while still ensuring professional standards. Vander was not entirely satisfied, but the other council members were, and the motion passed 3-1. Work began on the Renner farmhouse in the spring of 1871. By November of that year, the ward, as it came to be called, though it had no official name, was ready to receive its first patients. The first patient admitted to the ward was a quarry worker named August Brenner, 47 years old, a native of Baden-Württemberg, who had been in the valley for 2 years and whose lungs, Galt determined, had been severely compromised by stone dust. Brenner's breathing had worsened through the autumn, to the point where he could no longer work, and his wife, Marta, had exhausted herself trying to nurse him while also managing their 4 children and the small kitchen garden that supplemented their income, when Galt suggested that August might benefit from the care of the ward. Consistent monitoring, proper ventilation, a diet calibrated to his specific condition, Marta Brenner agreed with the relief of a woman who had been carrying a weight she could not put down. She visited the following Sunday. The farmhouse had been transformed into something clean and orderly, with 4 beds in the main room and 2 in a smaller chamber off the kitchen that Galt had extended with a lean-to addition. There were linen curtains on the windows, a wood stove that kept the air warm and dry, and a smell that Martha associated with a hospital she had glimpsed in Baden as a girl. Clear's throat carbolic, metallic, precise. At the door in his white coat, Dr. Elias Galt met her and showed her to August's bed. August was sitting up, breathing more easily than he had in months. He held Martha's hand and told her the food was good and the doctor checked on him twice a day, and he was sleeping through the nights for the first time since summer. Reassured, Martha Brenner went home. She came back the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. The 3rd Sunday in January of 1872, she arrived to find that August had been moved to the smaller chamber off the kitchen. Galt explained that the main room was being used for a patient who required more intensive care, and that August's situation had stabilized sufficiently that he could be moved without any risk to his treatment. Gently and clearly, and with the unhurried manner that people in the valley had come to associate with absolute competence, he said this. Martha nodded and went to see her husband. She noticed that the door to the small chamber had a new bolt on the outside. She did not say anything about the bolt that day. She told herself it was for privacy, or for preventing drafts, or for some other sensible medical reason she did not have the expertise to understand. But the bolt stayed in her mind the way an unexpected sound stays in the ear long after it has passed. When she returned the following week, a woman she did not recognize answered the front door and told her that the doctor was not in and that visiting hours on Sundays had been changed to 2 hours in the afternoon beginning at 2:00. Martha had arrived at 1:30, and so she waited in the cold for 30 minutes and then was admitted and taken to see August, who was sitting in the same position as the week before in the same chair, with a blanket over his knees. He said he was feeling well. His voice was flat in a way that Martha could not quite identify. When she asked him whether he wanted to come home now that his breathing had improved, he said that the doctor thought it was too soon. When she asked him what the doctor had said exactly, he paused for a moment, a pause she would remember for the rest of her life, and said that he couldn't quite recall. Outside, walking back through the snow along the hollow road, Martha Brenner tried to understand what was bothering her. Her husband was alive. His breathing was better. The facility was clean and orderly, and under the care of a physician everyone respected. No evidence of anything wrong she had, only the bolt and the pause and the flatness in his voice, and the feeling, which she could not justify and could not dismiss, that her husband was being held in that house the way a specimen is held in a jar, preserved and still, and entirely in someone else's keeping. She did not know, as she walked home through the late January cold, that she had just had the last real conversation with August Brenner that she would ever have. He remained in the ward for 6 more years. The valley moved on as valleys do. The quarry expanded. 3 of the German families bought farmland and began to put down roots deep enough to feel permanent. A second general store opened. Its fresh coat of paint the Methodist Church got. Elias Galt's ward received, over the following years, a slow and steady stream of patients. some sent by Galt himself after house calls, some arriving through referrals from neighboring communities that had begun to hear of the facility. One or two brought in family carriages by relatives from as far as Albany who'd been told by someone who knew someone that Galt could manage conditions that other physicians had given up on. The ward expanded. By 1875, Galt had added a full second story to the Renner farmhouse and enclosed the into a proper wing. A woman named Theodora Kepler, who had trained as a nurse at a hospital in Utica and come to Harwick Hollow to care for an aging aunt, was hired as the ward's only regular staff besides Galt himself. Efficient and quiet Kepler was, and told anyone who asked that the work was satisfying and that Dr. Galt was an exceptional physician. Without warmth, she said this in the same careful, uninflected way that Galt himself spoke about nearly everything. Among the families whose relatives had been admitted to the ward, there was a layer of unease that grew slowly the way ice grows on a still pond. You can't see it happening, but one morning you step on what you thought was water and find it solid beneath your boot. Martha Brenner was not the only wife or daughter or son who had noticed something they could not name. Carl Fritsch, whose father Otto had been admitted in the spring of 1873 for a severe infection of the lower leg following a quarry accident, found that his father's improvement, which Galt reported regularly and in detail, never seemed to translate into any actual prospect of discharge. Each time Carl asked when his father might come home, Galt would describe another complication, another phase of treatment that needed to run its course, another risk of relapse that it would be irresponsible to ignore. The explanations were always plausible. In the same calm, methodical voice they were always delivered, and they always ended with Carl Fritsch walking back down the hollow road, feeling vaguely foolish for having asked. There was also the question of the records. When a patient died in the ward, and some did die, the very old, the very ill, those whose conditions had progressed too far, even for Galt's treatments to arrest. Galt filed death certificates with the county as required, and these were duly recorded in Coxsackie. But the certificates were filed in batches, sometimes months after the actual death, and the causes listed were invariably the patient's original presenting condition: lung disease, septic infection, heart failure. No county medical officer had ever visited the ward to inspect its records or its conditions. In itself, this was not suspicious. County medical oversight in rural New York in the 1870s was in practice nearly non-existent, but it meant that Galt's intake logs and his discharge records, the ones with the blank column, existed only in his own files in the farmhouse at the end of the hollow. In the summer of 1876, a circuit preacher named Absalom Crane came through Harwick Hollow on his annual tour of the valley communities. D.U. Crane was not a remarkable man in most respects, but he was observant, and he had been through the valley in each of the previous 6 years. And he noticed things that changed and things that didn't. He noticed that the old Renner farmhouse was considerably larger than it had been on his last visit. He noticed that there were more chimneys now, and that the curtains in what appeared to be upper-story windows were always drawn. He noticed that when he asked, at the inn that evening, about the facility at the end of the hollow, the innkeeper, a blunt, spoken man named Peter Scholler, paused before answering in a way that struck Crane as deliberate. "The doctor's place it is," Scholler said finally. "Galt's ward. And good work it does," Crane asked. Steadily, Schuyler looked at him. "People go in," he said. Crane waited. "And back out they don't often come," Schuyler said, and then turned away to wipe down the bar, and did not say anything more on the subject. Crane sat with his supper and thought about what Scholler had said. He thought about it for the rest of his circuit, and when he returned to Albany in the fall, he mentioned it almost as an afterthought over dinner with a colleague to a man named James Aldgate, who was a reporter for the Albany Evening Journal and who collected unusual observations the way other men collected stamps. Nothing about it did Aldgate write immediately, but he kept the name Elias Galt, Harwick Hollow, and he began quietly and without hurry to make inquiries. And it took James Aldgate the better part of 2 years to assemble enough information to feel that he was looking at something real rather than a collection of disconnected complaints and rumors. A careful reporter he was, careful enough that he had learned through painful experience the difference between a story and a grievance and the consequences of mistaking one for the other. So he gathered slowly. He obtained through the county clerk's office in Coxsackie the death certificates that Galt had filed between 1871 and 1878. 11 of them there were. He compared them against the intake records. He had been able to reconstruct, partially through interviews with families of admitted patients. The math was troubling. He could identify through those interviews at least 28 individuals who had been admitted to the ward during that period. 11 had death certificates. No record of any of the remaining 17 being discharged could he find. He traveled to Harwick Hollow in the autumn of 1878 and spent 4 days at the inn and had conversations with everyone willing to talk to him, which was fewer people than he had hoped. Peter Schuller, who had first planted the seed 2 years earlier through the circuit preacher's account, spoke with him at length, though always in the back room of the inn, and always after ensuring that no one else was nearby. Dramatic was not what Schuller told him. It was a series of small, ordinary observations that together formed a picture Aldgate found deeply unsettling. Schuller had seen patients in the ward's yard in the warmer months, sitting in chairs or walking slowly near the garden that Kepler kept on the south side of the building. He had spoken once with a man he recognized as Emil Vorst, a farmer from the northern end of the valley who had been admitted 2 years earlier for a severe winter illness that had nearly killed him. Vorst had recovered. By looking at him, anyone could see that. He was walking on his own, speaking coherently, and showed no obvious signs of serious illness. Heller had asked him when he was going home, and Vorst had looked at him with an expression that Schuller could only describe as carefully blank, and said that the doctor had not determined it was safe yet. Then around the side of the building Kepler had come and Vorst had looked away, and the conversation had ended, and carefully blank, that expression was the phrase that lodged in Aldgate's mind. Some version of it he had heard from Marta Brenner, who still visited her husband, August, every Sunday 4 years after his admission, even though August no longer seemed to recognize her with any consistency. He had heard it from Karl Fritsch, who had not been permitted to see his father Otto in over a year. Galt having explained that the elder Fritsch was in a delicate phase of treatment that required complete rest and minimal stimulation. He had heard it from a woman named Louisa Tanner, whose mother had been admitted in 1874 and who had received 3 months later a death certificate listing the cause as cardiac failure. Though Louisa's mother, when last Louisa had seen her, had been ambulatory, cogent, and in no apparent distress. A journalist, not a physician, Aldgate was, and he knew the limits of his expertise. But he had covered the Albany City Hospital for 2 years and knew something about medical practice, and what he was hearing suggested a pattern he could not explain through incompetence alone. Incompetence lost patients. It did not keep them. He requested an interview with Galt. Galt agreed, which surprised him. They met in the ward's front room on a cold Thursday in November. Precisely as clean and orderly as everyone had described the room was. whitewashed walls, scrubbed floorboards, linen curtains letting in the flat gray November light, a faint smell of carbolic acid that was not unpleasant. Galt sat across from Aldgate with his hands folded on his knees and answered every question in his careful, unhurried voice. The death certificates were accurate. The cases Aldgate had asked about were too sensitive for him to discuss, specifically as patient confidentiality was a professional obligation he took seriously. The facility's records were available to the county medical officer upon request. Nothing to hide he had, and resented the implication that he might. Aldgate asked as gently as he could about the patients who appeared to have recovered, but had not been discharged. For a moment, Galt looked at him. Then he said, "Recovery is not the same as cure, Mr. Aldgate. A man who stops coughing may still be contagious. A woman whose fever breaks may relapse without warning. The premature discharge of a patient whose condition I have not fully resolved is, in my professional judgment, a greater cruelty than keeping them a little longer than their family might prefer. I have seen what happens when people go home too soon. I have seen them die in beds their children sleep in. I have seen whole families consumed by illnesses that proper isolation would have ended. What I do here is not comfortable, but it is correct." A perfectly reasonable answer it was. It was the kind of answer that could not be argued with, because it was grounded in genuine medical logic and framed in terms of patient welfare. Aldgate left the ward that afternoon without having found a single thing he could point to and say this is wrong. He had only the feeling persistent, cold, specific that he had just been managed very skillfully by a man who had a great deal of practice at it. He had returned to Albany and began writing the only kind of story he could actually write. Not an accusation, but a question. The article appeared in the Albany Evening Journal on the 14th of February, 1879. Careful, measured, and deeply unsettling to anyone who read it closely it was. Aldgate did not accuse Galt of any crime. He described the ward's operations, the family's concerns, the gap between admissions and recorded discharges, and a series of questions he posed addressed nominally to the county medical board about the oversight of private care facilities in rural counties. No patients he named cited, no specific cases, and at no point made any allegation that could not be supported by documented fact. It was in every legal and journalistic sense an exemplary piece of cautious reporting. Within the valley of Harwick Hollow, it was also received as a declaration of war. Galt's supporters, and there were many because he had been the valley's physician for 13 years, and had in that time genuinely saved lives that would otherwise have been lost, were furious. A meeting the town council held, at which Cornelius Vander, now older and somewhat softened toward Galt, moved that the council send a letter to the journal expressing its confidence in the doctor's character and the facility's operations. Unanimously, the motion passed. The minister preached a sermon the following Sunday about the sin of slander. 3 of the German families, whose members were not patients at the ward, circulated a document signed by 42 residents vouching for Galt's professional conduct. Marta Brenner did not sign it, neither did Karl Fritsch, and there were 4 or 5 others, quieter, less willing to draw attention, who also did not sign, and who in the weeks that followed the article's publication found themselves the subjects of a kind of social pressure, that was not quite ostracism, but had much the same practical effect. What it believed the Valley had decided, and it believed in Alpheus Galt. And those who did not were an uncomfortable presence in a community that had organized itself around his competence for over a decade. But Aldgate's article had also been read in Albany, where it reached the desk of the State Medical Board's administrative secretary, a man named Horace Della, Croix, who was methodical in his own way, and who took seriously his obligation to follow up on credible complaints about licensed practitioners. Delacroix wrote to Galt requesting a formal submission of patient records for the preceding 5 years. Politely worded, the letter was, and framed as routine administrative procedure. It arrived at the Galt house on Fallow Creek Road in the 3rd week of February. What happened next is documented only indirectly. A farmhand named Silas Prout, who occasionally helped with deliveries along the Hollow Road, later told Aldgate that he had seen on the night of February 23rd a considerable amount of smoke coming from the chimney of the ward's new stone outbuilding, the one that had been added to the property in 1876, and that appeared to serve as a storage facility for the ward's records and supplies. More smoke than a heating fire would produce, it was Prout said. It was the kind of smoke that comes from paper. 3 weeks later, Galt submitted to the State Medical Board a set of records that covered only the years from 1876 to 1879, and that showed for that period 19 patient admissions and 19 corresponding discharges or death certificates. Clean, legible, and internally consistent the records were. Delacroix reviewed them, noted no immediate irregularities, and filed them. For the moment, the inquiry stopped. But something else had begun, because among the families who had read Aldgate's article and who recognized themselves in the questions it asked, without naming them, there was a slow crystallization of purpose. Isolated from one another they had been, each family managing its own uncertainty, its own carefully reasonable explanations, its own reluctance to seem ungrateful to the man who had after all kept their relative alive. But the article had shown them that they were not alone, that other people were asking the same questions, that the questions themselves were not unreasonable. A letter to James Aldgate, Martha Brenner wrote. So did Carl Fritsch. So eventually did a woman named Hedwig Rausch, whose brother Conrad had been admitted in 1874 and who had stopped receiving any communication from the ward in 1877. When Galt had informed her by post that Conrad's condition had deteriorated beyond the point where visits could be permitted. A 41-year-old Conrad Rausch would have been in 1879. His death certificate, which Galt had not yet filed, did not exist. In the spring of 1879, Aldgate traveled back to Harwick Hollow with the letters in his coat pocket and a considerably clearer sense of what he was dealing with. This time, he did not request a meeting with Galt. Directly to the ward he went and asked to see the patients. Kepler met him at the door. Polite and immovable she was. The ward was not open for unannounced visits. The doctor was not in. She would convey his request. Aldgate asked specifically to see August Brenner. Kepler said that Mr. Brenner's care requirements did not permit unannounced visits. To see Conrad Rausch, Aldgate asked. Kepler's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted in a way that Aldgate noticed and filed away. Aware of a patient by that name, she said she was not. Aldgate said that Conrad Rausch had been admitted to this facility in July of 1874 and had not been reported discharged or deceased. Discuss individual patient cases she could not, Kepler said. With perfect composure she said it. Marston, she closed the door. Standing on the steps of the former Renner farmhouse in the mild April light, listening to the sound of the bolt being drawn on the other side with that door, James Aldgate understood, with clarity that moved through him like cold water, that he was not looking at a story about negligence. Swift the investigation that followed was not, and clean it was not, and it did not produce the kind of dramatic single revelation that makes for a satisfying story. A slow accumulation of pressure, legal, medical, and journalistic, it produced that eventually made Elias Galt's situation untenable in a way that all his careful management could not address. With Martha Brenner it began. In May of 1879's Martha Brenner retained a lawyer, a young man in Coxsackie, named Deveriux Hollis, who had read Algate's article and who agreed at reduced fee to pursue a formal petition to the county court for access to her husband. The petition argued that Martha, as August Brenner's wife, had a legal right to information about his condition and to make decisions regarding his care. A straightforward legal argument it was, and well, Hollis made it. The county judge, a cautious man named Orville Strang, who was aware of Galt's standing in the community and disinclined to create controversy, nevertheless signed the order in June because he could find no legal basis for refusing it. Galt's response, submitted through his own lawyer in Albany, was to present August Brenner's condition as one of severe mental deterioration. The result, he claimed, was part of the original lung disease's impact on August's neurological function. In his own hand, he submitted a medical report describing a man who was no longer capable of self-directed action or coherent communication, and who required continuous institutional care for his own safety and the safety of others. He argued that Martha Brenner's visits, far from benefiting August, were causing him distress that set back his treatment. Judge Strang appointed a neutral physician from Albany, a man named Dr. Francis Cleary, to evaluate August Brenner's condition and report to the court. Cleary visited the ward on a Tuesday morning in August of 1879. A county constable accompanied him, which Galt had not been informed would be the case, and which Kepler, meeting them at the door, had no legal basis to refuse. For Galt himself was not present. At his office on Hollow Creek Road he was, and through the ward, with the careful composure of someone who had rehearsed this, or something like it many times, Kepler led them. What Cleary found in the main room of the ward was 3 patients, all elderly, all in beds, all in states of apparent sedation. Briefly he examined them and noted in his records the smell he associated with laudanum, the tincture of opium that was in the 1870s, legal, widely available, and routinely misused. He noted that the patient's muscle tone suggested long-term immobility, and that one of the 3, a woman he could not identify, as no names were displayed, showed signs of pressure sores, consistent with months or years of being confined to bed. To show him the remaining patients, he asked Kepler. The other rooms were in use and could not be disrupted, Kepler said. The constable said that the court order covered the entire facility. She would need to consult with Dr. Galt, Kepler said. Not an option currently available to her, the constable said that was, and past her into the hallway he stepped. The second and third rooms held 2 patients each in similar conditions to those in the main room. The small chamber off the kitchen, the one with the bolt on the outside, held 1 patient. At approximately 50, Cleary estimated the man's age, which matched August Brenner's age in 1879. Awake in a chair by the window the man was, and he looked at Cleary when Cleary entered the room with the slow, slightly unfocused attention of someone who had been in a chemically dampened state for a long time. His name, Cleary asked him, and after a pause the man said that his name was August. What month it was, Cleary asked him. Out the window at the summer light August looked, and then back at Cleary he looked and said he didn't know. If he wanted to go home, Cleary asked him. For a long time August was quiet. Then slowly and with evident difficulty he said, "I don't think the doctor wants me to." 6 words. That sentence spoken by a man who appeared physically recovered from a respiratory illness that had been his original reason for admission 8 years earlier, was the center of Francis Cleary's report to the court. The report concluded that August Brenner showed no signs of active disease requiring institutional care, that his cognitive impairment appeared consistent with prolonged administration of sedative compounds rather than neurological disease, and that whose retention in the facility was in Cleary's professional opinion and warrant, medically unwarranted. Carefully, the report also noted that the ward's population appeared to consist primarily of patients who had by all physical evidence recovered from their presenting conditions and who were being maintained in a state of pharmacological compliance that prevented it from exercising or expressing any desire to leave. Before the State Medical Board in October of 1879, Galt was called. Prepared with records, citations, and a detailed defense of his treatment protocols, he came. He argued that Cleary's observations were those of a general practitioner unfamiliar with the specific complexities of long-term chronic care. He argued that the medications he used were standard components of any responsible treatment regimen for patients with the profiles his ward served. He argued that Martha Brenner's petition was the product of a misunderstanding about the nature of her husband's condition, amplified by irresponsible journalism. Persuasive he was. Persuasive he had always been, and the board Trorscher Musica, Trorscher in 1879, was not equipped to act decisively on what it had, which was a pattern of suspicious evidence rather than a single clear crime. But watching they kept. And in the watching, more came out. A formal accounting of her brother Conrad Hedwig Roch finally demanded. Galt filed a death certificate in December of 1879, listing the cause as pneumonia and the date of death as September of the previous year. With Hollis's help, Hedwig did petition for access to the burial records. No record of Conrad Roch the cemetery on the Hollow Road had. Galt explained that Conrad had been interred on the ward's property, which he owned, at the family's request, a request Hedwig stated for the record. That had never been made by any member of the family, because no member of the family had been informed of Conrad's death until 15 months after it had allegedly occurred. An inquiry into the ward's property found, in the spring of 1880, evidence of a small enclosed area on the north side of the building that appeared to have been used as a burial site. The remains of at least 4 individuals it contained. Through the painstaking work of matching physical characteristics against intake records, 3 were eventually identified. Conrad Roch, a quarry worker named Philip Ostern, and a woman from a neighboring valley whose family had been told she was discharged in 1875. Never identified the 4th was. Through the entire process, Galt maintained that the burials had been with the family's knowledge and consent, that the deaths had been from natural causes consistent with the patient's conditions, and that the delay in filing documentation was an administrative failure, not a deliberate concealment. Repeatedly, and in several different legal forums, he was asked to explain the blank discharge column. A clerical system he had since revised, he said it was. An artifact of his record-keeping method, he said it was. It meant nothing, he said. The board could not prove that it meant anything definitive, but they could, and in the spring of 1885, they did. They determined that his practice of administering sedative compounds to patients without documented medical justification, his failure to maintain adequate death records, and his pattern of obstructing legitimate family access to patients constituted sufficient grounds for the surrender of his license. Administrative rather than criminal the proceeding was. No trial there was. No jury there was. A closed hearing there was. A formal agreement, and Elias Galt's signature on a document stating that he would cease medical practice in the state of New York. Music immediately and permanently. That spring he left Harwick Hollow. Somewhere west he went. Years later there were accounts that placed him in Pennsylvania, then Ohio, then further still, always in counties where his name had not preceded him. Under the ward on the Renner farmhouse property was emptied, and its remaining patients, 6 of them, including August Brenner, were returned to their families or, in 2 cases where there was no family to receive them, transferred to the county almshouse. Home to Martha in April of 1885, August Brenner came. 13 years he had been in the ward. 60 years old he was, and with the careful uncertainty of someone relearning a skill he walked. No specific memory of the years between roughly 1875 and 1885 he had. As a kind snorts of gray absence punctuated by occasional impressions they existed for him. A window, a chair, the smell of carbolic and laudanum, Kepler's footsteps in the hallway. For another 4 years he lived. In his own bed in the fall of 1889, with Martha beside him, he died. His death certificate, filed by the county physician, listed the cause as heart failure. Accurate it was. Not whether Elias Galt had done something wrong, was the question that James Aldgate spent the last years of his career trying to answer. Sufficient the evidence for that was, even if it had never been sufficient for a criminal conviction. The question that kept him awake, that he returned to in his notes and in the long, careful essays he published in the years after the ward was closed, was a simpler and more terrible one. Why? Not why in the abstract, not what was wrong with a man who could do this, but why specifically, mechanically, in the terms of Galt's own stated beliefs. Because Galt had on multiple occasions explained himself, not as an admission of wrongdoing, but as a defense of a philosophy, a legitimate tool for managing patients whose conditions made them difficult to treat through conventional means. The prolonged administration of sedatives, he argued, was a necessary consequence of taking recovery seriously. The extended stays were of refusing to discharge patients before he was certain, completely certain, Trocker clears throat, that they would not relapse, would not spread disease, would not return to him worse than when they had arrived. As a form of care that the families were too emotional, too impatient, too medically uninformed to appreciate, he spoke of it. In the end, Aldgate believed that this was not entirely a lie. Somewhere inside the system Galt had built at Harwick Hollow was a genuine medical conviction. He believed that if he could simply control all the variables, if he could maintain his patients in a state of perfect, managed stability, if he could prevent the unpredictable intrusions of the outside world, and the patient's own choices, and the chaos of ordinary life, outcomes that ordinary medicine could not, he could achieve. What Galt called keeping his patients alive too long was, in Galt's own framework, not a perversion of care, but its highest expression, he believed. What made Galt dangerous was not that he was indifferent to his patients. It was that he cared about them in a way that had no room for their autonomy, their relationships, their own experience of their existence. Cases to be managed they were, not people to be returned to their lives. And the institution he built, clean, orderly, plausible at every level, and wrapped in the impenetrable authority of medical expertise, was perfectly designed to prevent anyone from challenging that framework until the damage was already done. The same week Galt did Theodora Kepler left Harwick Hollow. Never called before any legal body, she was because the investigators determined that she had followed physicians' instructions throughout and could not be held accountable for what those instructions had produced. Whether she had known, at any point, that what she was participating in was wrong, whether she had pushed that knowledge down or rationalized it, or simply decided that the physician's authority superseded her own judgment, was a question that no one could definitively answer. An account of her time at the ward she never gave. Into another life somewhere she disappeared, another name perhaps. No record of herself that anyone has found she left. The Renner farmhouse stood empty for several years after the ward was closed, by a family from Albany who used it as a summer residence and who reportedly knew nothing of its history, it was eventually purchased. By the early 20th century, it had been substantially renovated. Barely visible beneath the additions by mid-century, the original structure was. Eventually, like so many buildings in valleys that time slowly abandons, into disrepair it fell, and then into the kind of ruin that becomes indistinguishable from the landscape, and then into the ground. The intake ledgers, the ones with the blank discharge column, were preserved in a county record storage facility that changed hands several times over the following decades. Incorrectly as a general hospital register from a now defunct facility, they were cataloged and filed under a heading that no one was likely to search. For nearly a century undisturbed, they sat there, 43 names and 31 blanks, waiting for someone who knew what they were looking at. When in the course of a local historical society's survey of county medical records, they were finally examined, the archivist who opened the ledger noted in her report that the handwriting in the discharge column was very clean, that it showed no sign of sound correction or revision, that whoever had maintained the tended from the beginning to leave those spaded from the beginning to leave those spaces empty. What to make of that she did not know. Accurately, she wrote it down and moved on to the next box. Some questions, it turns out, are answered not by revelations, but by the slow, patient accumulation of things that cannot be explained away. The blank column, the bolt on the outside of the door, the careful smoke from the outbuilding chimney on a February night, the 6 words of a man who had been kept alive carefully, methodically, professionally kept alive for 8 years past. Shane music, any medical necessity. Sitting in a chair by a window, with the summer light coming and saying that he didn't think the doctor wanted him to go home. Something about the nature of authority and the danger of expertise wielded without accountability, this mystery shows us. How an institution can be built on genuine care and still become a cage. How a man can dedicate his life to a principle and use that principle to justify things that should never have been permitted. What do you think of this story? Would or do you believe everything was revealed? What do you think happened to Elias Good after he went west? Do you think he stopped? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this story and want more dark histories like this one, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves the mysteries that history leaves behind. These are the stories that never made the front page, but they never really went away either. See you in the next one.